We'll put a fence around it. Okay, Jim, we'll put a fence around it, but I don't know what good that. The guy's just going to jump over that fence. The fence about that high, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I always will think the guy was in the house when we walked in the door, because we found the small bedroom window open, like he was going around, and he'd bring it back and he put a pile here. There was these green stamps.
Okay.
You collected green stamps and you put them in a book, and you got so many of those books, and you'd have a catalog, and you could pick out something in one of those books. Well, they were all sitting there in a pile in that back bedroom, as was some other things. The window was open, like he just hopped out the window when we walked in and hopped over the fence, and away he went. So that was of concern.
Daryl and Nancy were worried that the burglar would return to the cottage owned by the city. So the head of the Parks ordered a crew to build a fence around the Parkers' home. Unbeknownst to the Parkers, one of the laborers was a man named Wesley Peary. Peary had been a lifelong criminal, and he started young, stealing bikes and cars and pulling a gun on a police officer in 1939. He was sent to the boys' training school in Kearney, Nebraska. He burglarized a sorority when he returned. He broke into a house. He was arrested for shooting a farmer he worked for. He held up a Havelock gas station, and now he worked for the city Lincoln as a day laborer, erecting a fence outside the Parker home. He noticed Nancy Parker held a striking resemblance to his mother, a woman with whom he had a long, contentious relationship. Nancy worked for Gooch Flour and Noodle Company, and often worked at home developing recipes. The striking brunette also had her own cooking show on the local television station, which had only begun broadcasting in Lincoln 2 years earlier. A month later, tragedy struck the Parkers as Daryl went to buy Christmas lights to hang on an evergreen tree owned by the city in front of the Nebraska state capitol.
It was a stormy day, December 15th, 1955, I believe. And I was running errands for these lights that Mr. Ager wanted me to get and help this group of young people in Lincoln. Got the crew going out on the street doing tree work. Dutch elm disease was quite bad about that time, or somewhere in there. I had an older foreman. There's another, you do things a little bit differently than just I don't want to be a brash young kid telling an older guy that has got 20 years of experience in arboriculture as compared to my degree in forestry. Mm-hmm. You know.
Sure.
The two have to intermesh. Well, anyway, it got to be lunchtime, and I said, Jim, I'm going to run home over to the Antelope Park. Our office was in Antelope Park. Our home was in Antelope Park. Okay, so I said, I'm going to run home and grab a bite to eat, and I'll be back, and we'll get going some more with, I had to purchase a battery, I know that. But anyway, I came home and parked the car, and her car was still sitting there. I went in, the first thing I said was, hey, honey, I'm home. And usually, after the house was broken into, we thought we ought to have a little dog. So we had a puppy, some watchdog. And when I walked in the door, usually the pup would greet me, but there was no pup, there was no sound. So I started in the kitchen, went to the little bedroom, and then I walked into our bedroom. Scott, I want to tell you something. The picture that I'm bringing up right now is the same picture that I have lived with for over 63 years. I saw this beautiful young woman, stark naked, rope around her neck. She was dead. I'll tell you what, my whole world just collapsed. It's still difficult for me to talk about it today. My God, man, what's going on here? I literally collapsed. I managed to call my boss and got a hold of him and said, Jim, Nancy is dead. Brutally murdered. Anyway, he came right over, and I can't tell you this day. I've probably forgotten that. If I'd call the police, I think I'd probably call the police. I don't know. And of course, they were there in a very short time. And that's when my whole world collapsed.
Little could prepare Daryl for the grisly scene before him. Nancy has been raped and strangled with packaging twine, cut from a Christmas present resting on the kitchen table, and left spread eagle on their bed. Nancy Parker's slaying was only the second murder in Lincoln that year. The police department had little experience investigating violent crime in this white-collar community, which was not only the state capital but the home of the University of Nebraska. John Reed, an expert in interrogations, was flown into Lincoln from Chicago. Reed employed a variety of psychological techniques designed to make a suspect confess. George Mason University criminology professor Allison Redlick says Reed's legacy remains profound and controversial more than 60 years later.
In the 1930s or so, there was a commission, the Wickersham Commission. They basically abolished the third degree. No more hitting suspects and torturing them and shining bright lights in their faces and everything like that. And interrogators were saying, okay, what are we going to do? And really, in a way, John Reed and his collaborator, Fred Imbow, were kind of ahead of their time. And they started moving more towards this, what we have today, where interrogation methods are more psychological in nature. Some people would say psychologically coercive. Other people would just say, psychologically oriented. I think it depends on how you view it. But certainly what we know today is we do not need these physical methods of hitting and torture and everything in order to produce false confessions. These accusatorial confrontational methods, under certain circumstances, of course, the person has to be innocent. The things that I've been mentioning before, that, could be a very long interrogation. It could be that the person is very vulnerable. Lots of different things could go into why a person falsely confesses. But in the 1940s or so, John Reed and Fred Imbow produced their first interrogation manual, and it's now in its 5th edition. Back in 2013, they published the 5th edition. And to those who study interrogation, it's often referred to as the Bible of interrogation, and then the Reed method was discussed by the Supreme Court in the Miranda decision in 1966. And most interrogation methods that are used today in the U.S. are based on the Reed model.
This is Scott Reeder, creator of Suspect Convictions. 4.5 years ago, I gave up eating all sweets. I haven't had a dessert or a candy bar or anything in the last 4.5 years. So I was a little bit apprehensive this past week when RX Bars reached out to me and asked me to review their protein bars. I was wondering if it was going to be consistent with my diet. But then I got the bars in the mail and I looked and saw what the main ingredients are. 3 egg whites, 2 dates, and 6 almonds. Man, doesn't that sound healthy? And it turns out that real ingredients and real food actually can taste really good. Whether you like things sweet or savory or chocolatey or fruity, it's all there in your RX bars. In fact, RX bars come in 11 different flavors. And RX bars are gluten-free, soy-free, and dairy-free, and they have no added sugar. No artificial colors, artificial flavors, preservatives, or fillers. There's egg whites there for protein, dates there to bind it all together, and nuts for texture. RX bars are great for a number of different things, like breakfast on the go, a snack at the office, to throw in your bag before I get on a plane, toss in your backpack for a bike ride or a hike, or right after or before a good hard workout. And remember, egg white protein stands out as a source of protein that's easy for your body to absorb. If you're interested in RX bars, we can give you a 25% discount just for listening to this podcast. Go to rxbar.com/suspect and enter the promo code SUSPECT at checkout. Again, for a 25% discount, go to rxbar.com/suspect and enter the promo code SUSPECT at checkout. One more time, for a 25% discount, go to rxbar.com/suspect and enter the promo code SUSPECT at checkout.
Daryl Parker was vulnerable at the time he was called in for an interview.
The city of Lincoln was up in a big uproar. There was a mad dog killer on the loose. Put a lot of pressure on the police and the county attorney. Meanwhile, I was kind of walking around in the fog, man. Cry at the snap of a finger. And Morrison said, that was her maiden name. Morrison said, Daryl, can we take her back to Des Moines? I said, absolutely. So we took her back to Des Moines by train and had the funeral. It's where she's buried. There's quite a story there, and where she's buried today at Rest Haven Cemetery in Des Moines. I never got back there after the funeral was over. The county attorney called me and said, Daryl, we need you to come back to Lincoln. Some developments have taken place. We need you back here for the investigation. And I said, okay, that's fine. There's no reason why I can't. I'll leave in the morning and be back around noon, or maybe a little bit before noon. And so I did. And if you draw a straight line between Des Moines and Henderson, Iowa, to Lincoln, Henderson is pretty close to that line. So I said, well, to myself, I'm going to stop on the way home and let the folks know what's going on. So I did. And Mother says, Daryl, what are you doing here? I said, well, the county attorney has called me and wants me to come back to the Lincoln, that there's some stuff going on. He wants me there. I said, okay. So then Dad and Daryl, don't you want me to go with you? The biggest mistake I ever made in my life was right then. I said, sure, Dad, I want you to go with me. But I didn't. I said, no, Dad, it's too hard on you. You don't need to go. So I did myself. I got in the car. Mom and Dad had, as a graduation present from college, and as a marriage present, they'd bought me a new car. My brother, same way, bought him a new car when he was graduated. Well, anyway, went on to Lincoln and said, we want you to come out to the Highway Patrol headquarters, which is right adjacent to the penitentiary. And that's where we want to have our visit with you. Okay, so I got there, went in the building and said, well, I'm Daryl Parker here to see Elmer Shield. Big mistake. Boy, from that point on, changed my life immensely. I didn't know Shield. I'd met him at the house for just a few minutes when Nancy was murdered. He said, Daryl, I want you to meet somebody. Okay, fine. His name was John Reed, Mr. Reed. Come to find out, he was a criminologist from Chicago. Came in on a train ahead of me. This thing was a set-up deal for Shield. And he took me into this small room small lab room, twice the size of our bathroom, and said, "I'm John Reed. I'm from Chicago. Why did you kill your wife?" Just like that. "What the hell are you talking about, man? I never killed her. Never touched her." Well, that was just the beginning, Scott. He got his chair around, and it would sit much closer than we are now, much closer.
Okay.
The two chairs would be like this.
Touch it.
And he'd reach over and he'd hold up his, so now, Daryl, you know you killed your wife. Why did you kill her? You know you could have got a divorce. And he was rubbing my head. I said, "Hey, man, what the hell are you talking about? I did not kill my wife." And of course, I got very emotional. He just kept on that. "You're crazy, man." Well, everybody else was getting it. Why weren't you getting it? And you know, being a guy, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I just came completely unglued, right back to where I was the day I think that I found her. And I don't know, my mind is, to this day, is kind of blank as to how long that went on, 2 or 3 hours or whatever. And finally he said, "I want to talk with Mr. Shield for a while." So he took me out, set me in another room, and left me there for a while. And then, "Are you hungry?" "Well, yeah, I guess I could do. Oh, we'll get you a sandwich. What do you want to drink? A glass of milk?" "Okay." When he questioned me that second time, I'm going to sit here and it would be very easily for me to tell you, yes, I think I was drugged. I don't know. I cannot tell you for a fact that I was drugged.
They put some drugs in the milk? No.
I can tell you this was in a small photo development room. There was a counter over here. I was sitting here. The counter was, he had his back to me. He had the milk and the sandwich, and he was unwrapping the sandwich, and he could have very easily dropped some kind of a pill or something in my milk. I don't know.
Okay.
Of course, Shield poo-pooed the idea. I did not poo-poo the idea. I thought, well, maybe that's explains what happened next. The first interrogation, I was hung tough. Man, I was hanging in there. "Well, you son of a bitch, what are you talking about me doing this to Nancy? Never touched her, never hurt her." And that went on again, 2 or 3 hours, I don't know. But anyway, the second go around seemed like it was much shorter. With this pill or with his gazing or whatever, and his hand rubbing, that continued. Holding you, looked me in the eye, his face about that far from mine.
About a foot?
Why did all the other guys were, why wouldn't she give it to you? You were the husband. So that continued for quite some time. There was 2 Daryl Parkers. There was the first Parker, the guy hung tough. The second Parker, he was a washed up cookie. He was ready to confess to anything. And that's exactly what I did. I never denied making that confession. I did say it was a forced confession.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
What did you say?
I say, yeah, I did it. I wasn't getting sex. I got tired of her turning me down. So I just come home and said, "How about some sex?" And she said, "No." And I got crazy mad and choked her to death. Had sex with a dead body. Jesus. So that's why the big man Reed from Chicago. He got me.
How many hours were you interrogated?
From when I walked in at 11:30 a.m., they took me down to process me after midnight at the city jail.
So more than 12 hours of interrogation.
Yeah. Off, not constantly, but, you know, that had everybody in a frenzy. From that point in on, I never talked to the Morrisons again. So that's to get back to a prior conversation they had. Did they honestly think that I would do this terrible thing? Never talk to them again. I don't know. And to this day, I don't think much about it, but once in a while, the whole thing will kind of come over me again, and I'll kind of say, oh man, why did this have to happen? So anyway, the state proceeded to move forward, charged me with first-degree murder, and I just kind of gave up. But something else kind of came up that was kind of funny to me, and I think about it. I didn't much then. Boy, the next morning's newspaper, big headlines, Parker confesses to the wife's murder, in the Lincoln Star and the Journal. Man, I was the wife killer.
The day after confessing to the murder, Daryl recanted, insisting that he was innocent.
This is Scott Reeder, the creator of Suspect Convictions. And with me today is Michelle Ben-Simon, who is narrating this particular episode and also is a true crime buff from Canada. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
What was your reaction when you heard Daryl talking?
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed immediately like I believed him right from the beginning. I felt like he didn't sound like the type of guy who could do something like this. And I know it's just listening to his voice, but there's something in his earnest, genuine, kind of almost naive way of speaking that just seemed like, I don't know, it seemed like he loved his wife so much. I couldn't picture it.
Yeah, I first met Daryl 30 years ago when I was a young reporter. I was 24, 25 years old. I had just graduated from Iowa State myself, and I was sitting down to interview Daryl because he was trying to clear his name still, and he was seeking a pardon from the governor of Nebraska, and he was very frustrated because he was going through life as a felon, and not just a felon, but a convicted murderer, and he was understandably very stressed out about that. And I could really identify with this guy because I was the same age he was when he got convicted. I don't know if I could be able to deal with that situation any better than he did. I mean, it was just a heart-wrenching tale. I mean, of course, I went back and I met Daryl again last month, and we sat down and talked for about 4 hours in his condominium in Moline, and he's just the kindest, gentlest man I think I've ever met. I mean, it's almost unimaginable to me that anybody could associate him with violence in the first place. And I almost had to wonder, how did that guy survive in prison? I mean, he's such a gentle person. Michelle, I have a question for you. Can you quite fathom how somebody could go about confessing to a crime they didn't commit?
I mean, it just sounded like that form of torture creates a space where I can just imagine wanting it to end, first of all, but also creates this sort of fabricated reality that, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like, and as she was saying, like, it doesn't seem like the right sort of way to get the truth because people are so consumed by that small little world that's happening around them and the pressure. And I feel like it would be hard to even know what's real and not real anymore after being tortured for that long and manipulated and having your mind altered in whatever way, whether he was drugged or not. I think it's just, I can imagine getting to the point where you don't really know what else to say, because it didn't seem like they were going to stop until he said that he did it anyway. Unfortunately, false confessions still occur. Just why they happen is a point of contention. Dr. Allison Redlike is an international authority on false confessions.
False confessions make up between about 13 to 30% of known wrongful convictions. Of course, there are many, many wrongful convictions out there that are not known or not have been identified and officially exonerated. But that is, I think, one of the surprising things, that people would confess to a crime that they did not commit, especially a crime that's often quite heinous, a murder or a rape, those kinds of crimes. And most people, I think, they can't really put themselves in that position, and they would say to them, say to others, say to themselves that I would never falsely confess to something that I didn't do. But I think through these cases and through social science research, we're starting to see a very, very different picture. And when people ask me, why do people give false confessions? We usually talk about two different types of factors. One are situational factors, and the other are dispositional factors. And so situational factors are just factors that have to deal with the situation itself, which is often comes down to the interrogation techniques. And in the United States, the most well-known interrogation method is referred to as the Reid technique. And from talking with you earlier, I know that John Reid, the namesake of the Reid technique, was the one who actually interrogated Mr. Parker.
The prosecutor in the case was Elmer Scheel, a short, stout, former FBI agent who had been elected Lancaster County attorney. His case files began to fill with dozens of reports of people seeking a black Ford near the Parker home the day of the murder. Wesley Peary owned the car. Police questioned the ex-con but released him. Parker was questioned next, and he confessed. David Strauss, who wrote a book on the case, said it was never disclosed to Parker's attorney that more than 40 witnesses saw Wesley Peary's car near the Parker house the morning of the murder.
The legal system is only as good as the people that administer it. You can have the greatest system in the world, and if you got a bunch of dipsticks implementing it, you're going to end up with something like this. And that's just as true today as it was 50 years ago.
Herb Friedman, who is now in his 80s, is a veteran Lincoln attorney. As a law student, he observed portions of Darrell Parker's trial, and later he practiced in the same courtroom as Elmer Scheel.
I never got the impression that Elmer was a dishonest guy. He was a good lawyer. I don't believe that he would have pursued a case if he honestly thought this guy was wrong. But don't forget, he was an elected official. The guy had confessed. He would have been in a political hot spot if he said, yeah, well, he confessed, but I didn't believe the confession. He was between a rock and a hard place. Even to this day, I think there are people that still think that Darrell did it. This is a guy that did not come from a poor family. He didn't come from an uneducated background. I mean, his father had a couple of farms out over in Iowa. He was a graduate of Iowa State University, as was his wife. And he was on his way to a successful career as probably a bureaucrat or whatever he was. And he was with the JCs, for God's sakes. And on the day that this whole thing happened, he was working for the JCs, wanted to put on a Christmas party. He was pretty naive, quite frankly. But that's not against him. That's just what he was. He was just a young kid. Hell, he was a kid just a couple of years out of college.
So, didn't look good. First degree, electric chair. I didn't really give a shit, be honest with you. really did not give a good goddamn what happened to me then. Because everything that the both of us had worked toward for that last 2 or 3 years that I had courted her, and then when we were married and I got the first job, I thought it was a pretty good job for a young kid just out of forestry school. And of course, my professors were stunned in disbelief. They came out real strong for me. But anyway, then it got to be, the trial lasted about 3 weeks. My brother was an engineer at the time, and he helped Dad with expenses as much as he could. Ended up, Dad lost a farm over my expenses, because it seemed like from that time on, when I was sentenced when I was 25, when I was sentenced to life in prison.
About the same time Parker was convicted of murder, Wesley Peary was convicted of raping an Ohio woman. The woman was 7 months pregnant and miscarried. He was sentenced to 15 years in Ohio prison. Parker was sent to the Nebraska State Penitentiary, where he puts forestry training to good use, working in the prison greenhouse and solving landscaping problems on various state-owned properties across Nebraska. Eventually, he was allowed to move out of the cell block and into the greenhouse. Lincoln lawyer Herb Friedman said Darrell Parker was well regarded by prison officials.
Warren said, all these guys here say they didn't do it, and they all did. But Darrell Parker doesn't say he didn't do it, and I don't think he did. Even Warren didn't think this guy had done anything wrong.
In 1970, an appellate court ruled that Parker's confession was coerced. In a negotiated agreement with the state, he was paroled. But the conviction stood. He took a job as a laborer for a tree trimmer and was then hired by the Moline, Illinois Parks Department, where he rose to being the number 2 person in that agency. He retired from the city and took a job delivering legal documents for a large law firm in Davenport, Iowa. But he remained haunted by the murder conviction on his record. As Darrell Parker worked as senior manager for the Parks Department, Peary was released from an Ohio prison. He returned to Nebraska, where in 1975, while robbing a pawn shop, he shot a clerk in the head. Darrell Parker is relieved that the Lincoln police were able to solve this murder, in part because it was able to lead to clearing his own name.
Lincoln, at that time, things had changed, and they didn't have the same police chief that they had when I was in trouble, and they had some professional people, and they caught his ass. So he was convicted of first-degree murder, not to make it lightly, but they were going to set him an old Sparky electric chair.
Okay.
Now then, his heart was bad, and they took him to Omaha and operated on his heart, and he was on death row. Can you believe that? So then about that time, the good stuff starts coming out. He starts yakking, oh yeah, I killed Mrs. Parker, no big deal. And he gave a confession to 2 Lincoln lawyers.
The interview was tape recorded, but his attorneys were bound under the rules of client-attorney privilege not to share this information until after his death. Peary died of a heart attack in 1988, but even with Peary's confession, the state of Nebraska did not immediately clear Parker's name. The state had lost the semen and hair samples collected from the 1955 murder scene, so DNA could not be used to clear Parker's name. But then Nebraska Attorney General John Brunning uncovered the original prosecutor's files. In the files were dozens of witness statements taken in 1955 of people who saw Wesley Peary's car parked outside the Parker home in the morning of the murder. Brunning said this is what convinced him of Parker's innocence.
Yeah, I've been around 1,000 bullshit artists like we all have. You've reported on 1,000 guys that you know are full of shit when they're talking to you, and Darrell Parker was one that I knew was telling the truth.
The Attorney General gave Parker $500,000, the maximum allowed by Nebraska law, to compensate him for his years of wrongful imprisonment.
I don't think any of us would take the bet if somebody said we're going to put you away for 16 years and give you $500,000. I mean, it's a abysmal, tiny number for as much pain as that guy had to endure, finding his wife, and being in prison, and all that. I mean, it's a moderate acknowledgement by the state that, you know, we screwed up.
Next week on Suspect Convictions, we will explore the case of 23-year-old Iowa teacher Mary Beth Haglin, who months after being awarded a prestigious Fulbright scholarship, had an affair with a 17-year-old student. Was it love, crime, or both?